Imagine being just 8 years old, standing alone in the crowded streets of London with no parents, no home, no money, and no one legally responsible for your survival. Every passing stranger sees you, yet no one truly sees you. Hunger twists your stomach, disease lurks in every filthy alley, and the coming night promises only cold stones for a bed and danger around every corner. 5 centuries ago, this was not an unusual tragedy. It was an ordinary reality. In the closing years of Queen Elizabeth's reign, England was filled with children who had lost everything. Many wandered the roads, begging for scraps, and others worked until their small bodies collapsed, and countless more simply disappeared into history without leaving behind a single recorded name. Then, in 1601, Parliament introduced a law that would permanently alter the relationship between society and its poorest children. Known today as the Elizabethan Poor Law, it became one of the first attempts to make local communities legally responsible for helping the vulnerable. Yet beneath its promises of charity and order lay a difficult question that historians still debate centuries later. Did this law truly rescue England's orphaned children, or did it simply replace one form of suffering with another? To answer that question, we must step back into a country struggling to survive one of the most uncertain periods in its history. England, at the beginning of the 17th century, was a nation that appeared strong on the surface but hid deep scars beneath its growing prosperity. Queen Elizabeth had ruled for more than 40 years, bringing political stability after decades of religious conflict. Yet peace did not erase poverty. Across the countryside, failed harvests, outbreaks of plague, rising food prices, and economic changes pushed thousands of ordinary families toward desperation. Wealthy merchants prospered in expanding trade, while many laborers found themselves unable to earn enough to feed their children. Villages that had supported generations of farming families began to change as common land disappeared and opportunities became fewer. For countless people, survival became a daily struggle rather than a certainty. Disease only made life more fragile. Epidemics regularly swept through towns and villages, killing parents in a matter of days and leaving children completely alone. Without modern medicine, even illnesses that seem minor today could become fatal. Fever, influenza, dysentery, and plague spread quickly through crowded neighborhoods where clean water and sanitation barely existed. Entire households could vanish within a single season. Every epidemic created new widows, new orphans, and new families pushed into impossible choices. Death was so common that church bells rang almost every day, reminding communities that life could change without warning. At the same time, England had no national welfare system capable of protecting those left behind. There was no government agency to shelter abandoned children, no public orphanage funded by the Crown, and no organized network of social workers searching for vulnerable families. Survival depended almost entirely upon relatives, neighbors, or the local parish church. If a child had generous family members willing to help, there was hope. But if no one stepped forward, the future became frighteningly uncertain. Charity existed, but charity alone could never meet the overwhelming need. The church played an important role in caring for the poor. Parish priests encouraged wealthier members of the community to donate food, clothing, or money, believing that helping the needy was both a moral duty and a Christian obligation. Some churches distributed bread after Sunday services or collected alms for struggling widows. Monasteries had once provided significant assistance before their dissolution during the reign of Henry VIII, leaving many communities without institutions that had traditionally cared for the destitute. Although individual acts of kindness certainly saved lives, charitable giving remained inconsistent. One parish might support its poorest families generously, while another lacked the resources or willingness to do the same. A child's chance of survival often depended less on need than on geography and luck. Daily life reflected these harsh inequalities everywhere. London, already one of Europe's largest cities, attracted thousands hoping to escape rural poverty. Instead, many discovered overcrowded streets, where competition for work was fierce and wages remained painfully low. The city's narrow lanes overflowed with traders, laborers, servants, sailors, apprentices, and beggars. Open drains carried waste through the streets. Smoke from countless fires darkened the air. Markets bustled with activity, but prosperity rarely reached the poorest neighborhoods. Wealth and misery existed side by side, separated by little more than a single street. For children without parents, London could be both a place of opportunity and a place of unimaginable danger. Some earned a few pennies carrying goods, sweeping workshops, or running errands. Others begged outside churches, hoping worshippers would show mercy. Many simply wandered until exhaustion forced them to sleep wherever they could find shelter. Child abandonment became an increasingly visible problem. Most parents loved their children deeply, but crushing poverty sometimes forced impossible decisions. A widow unable to feed 3 young mouths might believe that leaving an infant outside a church offered a better chance of survival than keeping the child at home to starve. Fathers injured in dangerous work could no longer provide for their families. Mothers, weakened by illness, struggled to care for newborns. These tragedies were rarely acts of cruelty. More often, they reflected unbearable desperation. Communities occasionally found infants wrapped in blankets near church, doors before sunrise, left with nothing except a small cross, a ribbon, or a handwritten note asking strangers to show compassion. Older children rarely received even that small hope. They simply disappeared into the streets, joining the growing number of homeless boys and girls trying to survive alone. Begging became one of the few options available to them. English law already viewed wandering beggars with suspicion, especially those considered able to work. Authorities feared that increasing numbers of homeless people threatened public order, encouraged theft, and spread disease. Unfortunately, officials often failed to distinguish between hardened adult vagrants and terrified orphaned children. A hungry child asking for bread could easily be viewed as part of the same social problem as an adult criminal. Some youngsters were whipped for vagrancy, driven out of towns, or imprisoned alongside adults despite having committed no crime beyond trying to stay alive. Public sympathy existed, yet fear frequently outweighed compassion. As poverty deepened, exploitation followed close behind. Unscrupulous employers understood that desperate children would accept almost any conditions in exchange for food. Young boys hauled heavy loads beyond their strength, cleaned dangerous chimneys, or worked endless hours in workshops for little or no pay. Girls often entered domestic service at very young ages, where some found caring households, while others suffered neglect, overwork, or abuse hidden behind closed doors. Criminal gangs sometimes recruited abandoned children to steal from crowded markets because smaller hands attracted less suspicion. Survival itself became a dangerous occupation. Every decision carried risks, and every day required choices no child should ever have to make. As winter approached, the suffering became even worse. Freezing temperatures claimed lives that hunger had spared. Thin clothing offered almost no protection against cold winds sweeping through London streets. Bread prices rose after poor harvests, making food even less affordable for struggling families. Parish leaders watched the number of desperate people increase year after year. They saw widows unable to care for infants, elderly laborers too weak to work, and children sleeping beneath market stalls or church porches. It became increasingly obvious that voluntary charity alone could not solve a crisis growing larger with every passing season. England faced not merely individual tragedies, but a national social problem demanding a more organized response. The question was no longer whether the poor deserved help. The real question had become who should bear the legal responsibility for providing that help. Before long, Parliament would attempt an answer that changed English society forever. By the end of the 16th century, Parliament could no longer ignore what was happening across England. Every county reported rising numbers of poor families, abandoned children, wandering beggars, and elderly people unable to work. Local officials complained that voluntary charity was unpredictable and insufficient. Some wealthy citizens gave generously, while others gave nothing at all. Entire parishes struggled under the growing burden, and without a common system, one village might care for its poor, while the next simply forced them to leave. The government feared more than poverty itself. It feared disorder. Hungry people were more likely to steal, desperate families were more likely to migrate in search of food, and large groups of unemployed beggars challenged the stability that Queen Elizabeth I had fought so hard to preserve. Parliament concluded that charity could no longer remain a personal choice. It had to become a legal responsibility. In 1601, after decades of smaller experiments and earlier legislation, the Elizabethan Poor Law was passed. Although it was designed to help many different groups of people, including the elderly, widows, and the disabled, its impact on orphaned and abandoned children would shape English history for centuries. The law introduced an idea that was revolutionary for its time. Every parish was legally responsible for caring for its own poor. Instead of relying entirely on goodwill, each local community had to organize relief, collect funds, and supervise those in need. To make this possible, every parish collected a compulsory tax known as the poor rate. Property owners contributed money based on the value of their land, creating a public fund specifically intended to support the poor. Overseers of the poor were appointed to manage these funds, investigate local needs, distribute assistance, and ensure that money was spent according to the law. For the first time, poverty was not treated solely as a private family problem or a matter for religious charity. It became an issue of public administration. The law recognized that not all poor people were the same. Those who were elderly, seriously ill, or unable to work were considered deserving of relief and could receive food, clothing, fuel, or financial assistance. Widows with young children often received support that allowed them to remain in their homes instead of abandoning their families. But for healthy adults and older children, the expectation was different. Work was viewed not only as a means of survival, but also as a moral obligation. The lawmakers believed that honest labor protected both individuals and society from idleness, crime, and dependency. Therefore, one of the law's central goals was not simply to feed the poor, but to put them to work whenever possible. For orphaned children, this principle usually meant apprenticeship. Parish officials were given the authority to place poor children with skilled craftsmen, farmers, merchants, or household servants until they reached adulthood. Boys were commonly apprenticed until the age of 24, while girls often remained in service until the age of 21 or until marriage. In theory, this arrangement benefited everyone. The child received food, clothing, shelter, and vocational training, while the master gained an extra pair of hands to help with daily work. Many lawmakers genuinely believed they were giving children the opportunity to build productive, independent lives instead of growing up as beggars. Yet the reality depended entirely upon the character of the master and the conditions of the household. Some apprentices were treated almost like members of the family. Others became little more than unpaid laborers. To understand what this law could mean for one child, imagine a boy named William. Although William himself is fictional, every detail of his story reflects the experiences recorded in parish registers, apprenticeship contracts, and court documents from early 17th century England. William was 9 years old when his father died, after fever swept through his village outside London. His father had been a carpenter, respected but never wealthy. Within weeks, William's mother also fell ill. Neighbors brought herbs, broth, and prayers, but nothing stopped the disease. Before autumn arrived, she too was buried in the churchyard beside her husband. Suddenly, William found himself completely alone. At first, neighbors shared what little food they could spare, but everyone struggled to survive. Another poor mouth to feed quickly became an impossible burden. Eventually, William packed the few possessions he owned into a small cloth bundle and walked toward London, believing that a city filled with people must surely offer hope. Instead, he discovered a place where thousands competed for the same opportunities. During the day, he searched markets for discarded vegetables or stale bread. At night, he curled beneath wooden carts or sheltered beneath the stone arches of churches, wrapping himself in torn blankets to keep out the cold. Every morning began with uncertainty. Would he find enough food to survive another day? Would someone chase him away? Would sickness finally claim him as it had claimed his parents? Weeks turned into months. His clothes became little more than rags, his shoes split apart, and his face grew thin from constant hunger. One icy morning, while begging outside a parish church, William caught the attention of one of the local overseers of the poor. The official had seen the boy several times before and recognized that he belonged to no household. After asking questions and speaking with local residents, the overseer confirmed that William had no surviving relatives willing or able to care for him. Under the new provisions of the Poor Law, the parish accepted responsibility. For the first time since losing his parents, someone recorded William's name in an official register. It was a small act, but a meaningful one. He was no longer invisible. Soon afterward, parish officials arranged for William to become an apprentice to Thomas Fletcher, a blacksmith living several miles away. The apprenticeship contract stated that Thomas would provide food, clothing, shelter, and instruction in the trade until William reached adulthood. In return, William would obey his master faithfully, avoid gambling and drunkenness, keep household secrets, and work diligently. The agreement sounded fair. When written on parchment, living it proved far more difficult. William's first months were filled with exhaustion. He woke before sunrise to sweep the forge, fetch water, chop wood, clean tools, and care for the horses brought for shoeing. The heat from the furnace was overwhelming, while the heavy hammers seemed far too large for his young hands. His muscles ached every evening, and burns from flying sparks covered his arms. More than once he cried quietly after everyone else had gone to sleep, wondering whether he would ever see the simple happiness of childhood again. Yet Thomas Fletcher was not a cruel man. He demanded hard work, but he also believed that discipline should produce skill rather than fear. As William grew stronger, the blacksmith began teaching him how to shape iron, repair wagon wheels, forge nails, and craft horseshoes. Each successful task brought a little more confidence. For the first time since his parents died, William imagined a future that extended beyond tomorrow's search for food. Years passed. The frightened orphan gradually became a capable young craftsman. His hands, once too small to hold a hammer, now moved with practiced precision. Local farmers respected his workmanship. Merchants trusted him to repair valuable equipment. By the time William completed his apprenticeship, he possessed something that countless abandoned children had never been given, a trade that could support him for the rest of his life. Eventually, he earned enough money to rent a small workshop of his own. He married, raised children, and never again slept on a freezing street wondering where his next meal would come from. Stories like William's explain why many historians argue that the Poor Law genuinely transformed lives. Without parish intervention, he might have died from hunger, disease, or violence before reaching adulthood. The apprenticeship, despite its hardships, gave him stability, education, and opportunity, but William's experience represented only one possible outcome. Not every master possessed Thomas Fletcher's sense of responsibility. Some apprentices endured brutal beatings, endless labor, insufficient food, and dangerous working conditions. Others were valued only for the free labor they provided. Parish officials often lacked the time or resources to inspect every household regularly, allowing abuse to continue unnoticed for years. For every child whose apprenticeship became a path toward independence, another experienced exploitation that left lasting physical and emotional scars. The Poor Law had created a system that could rescue vulnerable children, but it could not guarantee kindness. Its success depended less on the words written in Parliament than on the humanity of ordinary people who enforced those words every day. As England entered a new century, the law brought order where chaos had once prevailed. Yet it also raised difficult questions that would echo through history. Was survival enough if it came at the cost of freedom? Could compulsory labor truly be called protection? And how should society measure justice when the choices available were shaped by poverty itself? The answers to those questions have never been simple, and perhaps that is why the Elizabethan Poor Law continues to fascinate historians more than 4 centuries later. It was neither a perfect act of compassion nor a cruel conspiracy designed to exploit the poor. It was something far more human, a law created by people trying to solve a crisis with the limited knowledge, resources, and beliefs of their own time. To understand its true legacy, we must examine both what it achieved and what it failed to accomplish. On one hand, the Poor Law undoubtedly saved lives. Before its introduction, many orphaned children simply disappeared into the streets, where hunger, disease, violence, and exposure claimed countless young lives. Parish records from the 17th century reveal that thousands of children were placed into households where they received regular meals, clothing, and at least some form of supervision. Widows who might otherwise have abandoned their children because they could no longer afford to feed them sometimes received enough relief to keep their families together. Organized collections of the poor rate meant that assistance no longer depended entirely upon the generosity of wealthy neighbors or the unpredictable charity of local churches. For perhaps the first time in English history, communities accepted that caring for vulnerable people was not merely a matter of kindness, but a legal duty. The law also reduced visible begging in many towns. Parish officials actively identified those in genuine need and attempted to provide assistance before desperation forced them onto the streets. This did not eliminate poverty, but it created a more structured response than had existed before. Children who entered apprenticeships often learned valuable trades that allowed them to earn honest livelihoods as adults. Some became carpenters, blacksmiths, tailors, shoemakers, weavers, or farmers. Others entered domestic service and eventually established households of their own. For these children, the law offered not simply survival, but the possibility of social stability. It transformed lives that otherwise might have ended in anonymous suffering. Yet acknowledging these successes should never require ignoring the law's darker side. The same apprenticeship system that rescued some children also trapped others in years of exhausting labor. Contracts were legally binding, leaving young apprentices with little power to escape abusive masters. While many employers fulfilled their obligations honorably, others viewed parish children as a source of inexpensive labor rather than as vulnerable human beings deserving care and respect. Long working hours, harsh discipline, inadequate food, and physical punishment were not uncommon. Some apprentices lived in constant fear, enduring conditions that today would clearly be recognized as child abuse. The law also separated children from familiar places and surviving relatives. Even when distant family members cared deeply for an orphan, poverty often prevented them from providing a home. Parish authorities could decide that apprenticeship elsewhere offered better economic prospects, effectively removing children from the communities where they had been born. Brothers and sisters were sometimes placed with different households, growing up apart and rarely seeing one another again. Emotional bonds carried far less legal weight than economic necessity. Childhood itself was understood very differently in the early 17th century. Modern societies generally recognize children as individuals requiring protection, education, emotional support, and opportunities to develop gradually into adulthood. Elizabethan England viewed childhood through a far more practical lens. Children were expected to contribute to family survival as soon as they were physically able. Work was not considered an unfortunate interruption of childhood. It was viewed as preparation for adult responsibility. The Poor Law reflected these beliefs. Its authors did not imagine that placing a child into employment conflicted with protection. In their minds, work itself was protection because it prevented hunger, idleness, and crime. Judging the law fairly, therefore, requires understanding the world in which it was created, rather than measuring it only by modern standards. Even so, history teaches us that good intentions alone cannot guarantee justice. Over the centuries, England continued to struggle with poverty despite the Poor Law. As the population grew and the Industrial Revolution transformed the economy, entirely new challenges emerged. Factories demanded cheap labor, and children once again became essential workers in mines, textile mills, and manufacturing workshops. Boys and girls barely older than William had been worked long hours beneath dangerous machinery, crawling through narrow tunnels, cleaning moving equipment, and breathing polluted air that damaged their lungs. The lessons of the Elizabethan system were not forgotten, but they proved insufficient for an industrial society. During the 19th century, reformers began demanding stronger legal protections for children. Public investigations exposed shocking conditions inside factories and mines. Writers, journalists, religious leaders, and members of parliament argued that economic progress should never come at the cost of a child's health or future. These campaigns eventually produced the Factory Acts, beginning in the early 19th century and expanding over time. These laws limited working hours for children, established minimum ages for certain occupations, required basic education in some industries, and introduced inspections intended to enforce the rules. While far from perfect, they represented a significant shift in society's understanding of childhood. Children were increasingly seen not simply as workers, but as individuals deserving special protection. Later, Victorian reforms continued this transformation. Compulsory education gradually became more widespread, reducing the number of children entering full-time. Labor at very young ages. Public health measures improved sanitation, reducing the epidemics that had orphaned so many families in earlier centuries. Charitable organizations expanded their work with neglected children, while new laws strengthened oversight of guardians and employers. By the 20th century, Britain had developed far more comprehensive systems of social welfare, healthcare, education, and child protection than the lawmakers of 1601 could ever have imagined. Modern child protection agencies investigate abuse. Courts consider the welfare of children as a primary concern, and international agreements recognize children's rights to safety, education, healthcare, and freedom from exploitation. None of these achievements appeared suddenly. They were built slowly across generations through countless reforms, debates, failures, and improvements. In that long historical journey, the Elizabethan Poor Law occupies an important place. It was one of the earliest moments when the state acknowledged that communities carried a legal obligation toward vulnerable children. Although its methods often reflected the harsh realities of its era, the underlying principle that society bears responsibility for those who cannot protect themselves became a foundation upon which later reforms were constructed. Looking back, it is tempting to divide history into heroes and villains, to declare that one generation possessed wisdom while another lived only in ignorance. Reality is rarely so simple. The parish officials who placed orphaned children into apprenticeships believed they were preventing starvation. The craftsmen who trained young apprentices often worked under difficult conditions themselves, and the lawmakers who approved. The Poor Law faced enormous social problems without the benefit of modern economics, medicine, psychology, or social work. They made decisions shaped by the knowledge of their own age. Some of those decisions saved lives, others caused suffering. Both truths exist together, and understanding history requires accepting that complexity rather than avoiding it. If William had remained alone on the streets of London, his story might have ended before his 10th birthday. Instead, he survived because a law compelled strangers to take responsibility for a child who otherwise belonged to no one. His fictional journey reflects the experiences of countless real children whose names survive only in fading parish registers and apprenticeship records. Some found opportunity, others endured hardship. Together, their lives remind us that every society is judged not only by its wealth or military strength, but by the way it treats its most vulnerable members. The Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601 was far from perfect. Many orphaned children continued to suffer unimaginable hardship despite its protections, and many apprentices endured years of exhausting labor under demanding masters. Yet the law also marked one of history's earliest attempts to recognize that society, not just individual families or private charity, had a legal responsibility to care for vulnerable children. That idea, imperfect though it was, became the first step on a long road leading toward modern child welfare, compulsory education, labor protections, and the recognition of children's rights. Every safeguard that exists today rests upon centuries of experience, reform, and hard-earned lessons. The forgotten children of Elizabethan England helped shape that history, even if most of them never lived to see its results. Their struggles remind us that progress is rarely immediate, but every meaningful change begins with the recognition that human lives matter. Thank you for joining us on this journey into one of Britain's most overlooked chapters of history. If you enjoyed this story and would like to discover more true historical accounts from Britain's darkest past, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next documentary. Until next time, thank you for watching.